future belongs to service providers who innovate without limits. That's why the fastest growing service providers are choosing the NetSapiens platform. Visit netsapiens.com.
Hey everybody, it's Doug Green and I'm the publisher of Technology Reseller News, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Shashi Kiran, Chief Marketing Officer at Nile. Shashi, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Doug.
Well, as I was just saying before we started podcast today, and I think people will be seeing this because they'll see a string of podcasts on infrastructure, this must be Infrastructure Week. At this one, we're talking about infrastructure budgeting, so that's really important. Before we dive into that, though, Shashi, what is Nile?
Well, Nile is a fairly unique company, which is modernizing a lot of enterprise networks globally. We like to call ourselves as the world's most secure network delivered as a service. And what we do is provide wired and wireless solutions for local networks, mid to large enterprises with security inherently baked in. And we operate the networks as well. We both build and operate it. So it's our technology. And so that leads to a lot of cost savings and breach reduction and cost speed, all of the good things that organizations today care about.
So, we're hearing, of course, nonstop about AI. That's been going on for 4 years. And conceptually, I think we sort of think of AI as something that happens, it's somewhere else. We see it on our phone or screen or something, but how it's happening is may as well be on another planet. But now we're starting to hear more and more every day about infrastructure.
Yeah, look, I think infrastructure has made a very strong comeback. If you'd asked people a couple of years ago, SaaS companies would be considered non-sexy and infrastructure companies would be sexy and have premium valuations. Nobody would have believed us, but here we are. And I think that really speaks to the strategic nature of infrastructure as a founding building block for a lot of things that AI enables. So it's increasingly becoming a control point for AI enablement and productivity across companies globally.
And so, if it's a foundational building block, and I thought that was a very interesting way of putting it, it has to also be the foundational building block of your budgeting process. Yeah.
Look, that's the interesting part because unlike software, you can't just add infrastructure or make changes to infrastructure on the fly. And how you strategically choose infrastructure has a bearing that is multi-year, and it will have a ripple effect in terms of the cost impact as well. If you choose the right kind of infrastructure, it can be an enabler for all the applications and software and people and AI agents and whatnot that you spend. But choose the wrong thing, it can act as a huge drag. So I think there is a concerted look happening now in terms of what's the right kind of infrastructure that enables the organization strategically. So the infrastructure spend could be 10%, but if it's holding the other 90% of your spend hostage, then certainly that's not the situation you want to be. So it's getting a relook top down from CEOs, CFOs, obviously, but also the custodians of infrastructure traditionally, which is the CIOs and the CISOs.
And Shashi, I'm glad you've sort of reintroduced our language today, long term. With cloud, one of the ways we all got seduced by cloud was, hey, you've got a problem, you can change it this afternoon, right? For everybody, send out a signal and that's it. Infrastructure, you've got 20-year decisions.
Yeah, if you look at the genesis of cloud, cloud was always a means to an end, right? People didn't want to go to cloud just because it was the next bright, shiny object. They went there because it gave them ability to manage change inordinately faster. If you think of the pre-world before cloud, there was a lot of servers that were being shipped, deployed on premises, and people used to, load software in floppy disks, if you remember that era, and truck rolls every place. And you had to kind of do that with a long planning process. And as businesses started to become more digital, that was certainly a drag for many of them. So cloud gave them that speed button, if you will, that allowed them to go build things on the fly, ship things on the fly, and time to value got compressed. So it was actually a proxy for agility in business. And I think now we're seeing the same thing across the rest of the infrastructure. A lot of this transformation happened in the data center because the goal was to bring data into a centralized location, co-locations, cloud, whatnot. But now you're seeing the distribution of data. And you talked about AI. You're also seeing the AI constructs become disaggregated and distributed. So infrastructure is becoming a lot more pervasive, and how you look at it in terms of its ability to deliver business value is really the lens that a lot of the C-suite is considering right now.
So is that becoming a challenge for organizations? Is that becoming a real problem in a way?
Yeah, think about it, right? So, as I said, it's sort of foundational, and it's not easy to rip and replace. So, typically, infrastructure refresh cycles have been, 5 to 7 years, and if you take sort of the wrong decision, then the rest of your business is held hostage for that long period of time. So, you're seeing people get ahead from a planning perspective and say, what is it that will allow my infrastructure to be as agile as software? And so that's where we see this notion of as a service, which really was the tailwind for software. Software as a service is what gave it a lot of oomph. We're seeing that now becoming a reality with infrastructure as well. How do you get infrastructure to be as speedy as the needs of your business? How can you manage change? And when you're doing so, how can you not add a lot of headcount because nobody is getting a ton of resources? And how can you do it where you don't need to scrounge huge capex budget every 5 to 7 years? So you're seeing this debate between tokens and headcounts becoming very real in majority of the organization. So everybody's getting a little smarter, and in that context, I think solutions such as network as a service or infrastructure as a service, where a lot of the complexity is taken out of the system, is something that they're seeing a lot of value in.
Explain that to me. We hear this term network as a service or even infrastructure as a service. What does that really mean?
Look, I think it's a bit of a convoluted term in the industry. It's gotten baggage. Historically, if you look at network as a service, you had the telcos and the MSPs that were orchestrating management on top of somebody else's technology, and they were delivering it as a service. So when things went wrong, or if you needed to manage change, it wasn't really easy because there were multiple companies involved, right? And now you want the ability to detect something, not just when it goes wrong, but you want to actually prevent something ahead of it going wrong. So how do you maintain the visibility across the entire value chain? How do you make sure that the link is secure end to end? How do you manage change? So these are all top of mind care abouts. And I think the modern NAS is really about companies that are building and owning the technology, but also operating the service. So they do have an end-to-end purview of the foundational building blocks. But with AI, you're in a position to bring about how you operate autonomously. And that's a huge value add, because think about a mid to large enterprise that has several locations. They really don't have IT staff in all of these locations. And so they end up outsourcing to different providers, different system integrators. They all bring in non-standardized operational models. And so this is where you see that outside of the data center, 70% of successful breaches are coming from there, because it's just a large surface area of complexity that you have to protect, secure, and it's very hard to do that. And again, for every dollar of capex that you would typically spend in a legacy environment, most companies spend $5 to $7 operating it over the life cycle. And that's a huge cost structure as well. So these are the things that are no longer feasible. And ideally, you want something that is more OpEx friendly. You want something where you can move quickly. You want something where you can detect things. So the modern NAS is really about that, where you take advantage of a different architecture, because clearly you can't expect new things by doing things the old way. So the model has to change, the architecture has to change. It's a clean slate approach in some cases. And you have to have network security being built in. These are no longer separate constructs. And how do you operate them autonomously? So you shrink that cost structure and make it more easy for companies to consume infrastructure based on the needs of the business. So that's sort of where the modern NAS is. So you kind of look at previous legacy architecture, which were the box companies, and they used to build these technology, and somebody else was operating it, either IT team internal to the company or these outsourced entities. And if you looked at the as a service delivery, it was the providers and the telcos, but it was not their technology. They were aggregating technology from different vendors, going through a long certification process. So now all of that has really been compressed. So you build, you ship, you automate, you operate, and it's all one entity. So one hand to shake, one throat to choke.
And is that the approach you at Nile are taking with your clients?
Yeah, so Nile's taken a radically different approach, which is highly simplified. And we've really focused on the edge of the enterprise, the campus environments, the branches, because if you think about it, a lot of focus, as I mentioned, has been in the data center and cloud. And these are very machine intense environments. But if you look at the branch and cloud campus environments at the edge, you have the users, devices, things, and now agents coming about. So it's just this petri dish of complex variables, but the architecture there has really not changed since the 1990s. And we still see this wild west out there, which is one of the reasons for this high operational costs. And now with agents, there's a decrease in productivity, but also security threats and breaches are the highest there. So that's the attack surface that we have tried to address. And we said, we're not going to go do it by the traditional way. We didn't need to come out with yet another box, yet another feature that wouldn't change the architecture in the industry. So this is a radically new architecture, which takes a clean slate approach, shrinks the complexity that you see in traditional environments, takes a very deterministic approach for wired wireless connectivity, normalizes IT and IoT, and has an agentic infrastructure. So that's sort of the core foundation, which is built on zero trust principles. We call it a zero trust fabric. And it consolidates the different appliances that you would typically see in this environment. So it shrinks the complexity from an infrastructure perspective. And when you shrink that complexity, it's easier to bring in security, or it is easy to apply AI and get exponential benefits. And obviously, you take advantage of the cloud for change management. But the other aspect is we take ownership of the operations across the life cycle. And so that means, these companies, they subscribe to the service. We guarantee them a performance SLA, which is backed by financial penalties. By the way, that's fairly unique in the industry today. And the reason we can do that is because we own the entirety of the value chain. So for our customers, one is because we reduce the surface area, the breach reduction is inordinately high. Second, we kind of normalize IoT, OT. We built in native identity-based authentication, so there's a continuous identity enforcement. Then whatever we do, it typically reduces cost by 30 to 50% at a minimum.
Wow.
And change management is 3 to 5 times faster. So these are the benefits that they start getting: security, simplicity, savings, speed, and obviously the SLA. So I call these as the 5 S's.
I was going to ask you about ROI, but that's 30 to 40. What did you say? 30 to 50%?
Yeah, that's sort of the floor, not the ceiling. And
okay.
Most companies, as I said, one is you reduce infrastructure. Just by virtue of that, there's a lot of inherent reduction. But then we reduce this huge operational cost burden and combine the two. They don't need as many devices, and then they have this huge IT force multiplication that we're bringing through the solution. So all of these, at a minimum, it's in that range for a majority of our customers.
So as we close up our podcast today, what are you looking at for the, we're sort of like dead center in the year, we're half the year's ahead of us, and we're starting to just glimpse maybe summer 2027. What do you see ahead?
Look, I think the next 2 to 3 years, there's just going to be a tremendous amount of focus on this. And companies that can embrace the change and decide to walk away from legacy will derive significantly larger benefits from it, right? So there's just a huge amount of focus today on, let's say, AI chips, but even as Jensen talks about it, the whole value of AI is from this 5-layer cake. And so how do you look at infrastructure as being a foundation of that 5-layer cake for any organization to become more AI native? And eventually that also is a means to an end. So engaging with this, experiencing this, and seeing how it can provide value, productivity wise, savings wise, security wise, I think that's where we expect a lot of the engagements to happen.
Shashi, I really want to thank you for joining me today. This is very interesting. Let's do this in at least the next quarters. When we jump into the fall, see where we are and get an update. But for now, where can we learn more about Nile?
Well, our website is nilesecure.com, and would be happy to engage with anybody that's interested to learn more.
All right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having us, Doug.
Innovate without limits, scale without compromise, and never pay per seat again. Discover why providers choose netsapiens.com